Hello and welcome to Committee Corridor. 1.3 million people on waiting lists for social housing. More than 160,000 children in temporary accommodation. Private rents are rising and fewer people have access to the property ladder. It's all adding up to what many are calling a housing crisis. But even as the government pledges to build 1.5 million new homes, there is another crisis in full view. Whether building new homes or adapting old ones, housing is high cost and high carbon business. The UK has committed to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and we are one of the most nature depleted countries in Europe. Where do we go from here? I'm Toby Perkins, the Labour Member of Parliament for Chesterfield, and I chair the Environmental Audit Select Committee, the EAC, at the House of Commons. A roof over our heads and somewhere safe, secure and affordable to live. But here in the UK, there isn't enough to go round. Later, we'll hear from the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee about the shocking numbers of children in temporary accommodation and the recommendations it has made to government to address this. On the EAC, we're exploring how the government can deliver its plans to back the builders, not the blockers, while balancing environmental objectives. And we'll be joined by Lord Moylan, who, as chair of the House of Lords Built Environment Committee, said there was a real risk that the last government would miss both housing targets and the UK's environmental ambitions. Have things changed? But first, the National Housing Federation is the voice of England's housing associations. They represent their view of the sector to policymakers and government. Kate Henderson is its chief executive. She joins me now. Kate, welcome to Committee Corridor.
Hello, Toby. It's great to be on Committee Corridor.
Well, thank you so much. And can you start by helping us understand why the shortage of housing is being called a crisis?
So decent, secure homes that people can afford are the foundations of a good life and a strong economy. Yet for decades, England has really lacked a clear long-term housing strategy. And right now, there are millions of people across the country who cannot access the housing that they need. There'll be people listening to this podcast who are in their 20s, 30s, maybe in their 40s, who are unable to move out of their parents' homes, unable to save up for a mortgage, and are really stuck either living at home or paying high rents in the private rented sector. There are a rising number of older people who are also living in insecure private rented accommodation. And we did a survey that found nearly 2/5 of older private renters are struggling with things like buying food, heating their homes, or paying for clothes. And of all those who are being let down by our failing housing system, it's children that are suffering the most. There are currently over 165,000 children who are growing up in temporary accommodation. That's living in things like B&Bs, having to share kitchens, not having space to play, space to do homework, really living in unacceptable, insecure housing. So this is affecting communities right across the country. It's affecting people's health, life chances, and the country's financial security. I should say it didn't happen overnight as well. The housing crisis has taken decades to get to this point, and it's going to take a real system-wide change to address it.
Yeah, and I mean, you spelled out there very fully the extent of the housing crisis and the impact that is being caused. Tell us where housing associations and the National Housing Federation fit into the housing environment that we have and the solution that we need.
Yeah, so housing associations are not-for-profit social landlords, and they provide homes and support services to around 6 million people in England. At the National Housing Federation, we are the trade body representing those. Our focus is on supporting our members to deliver their social purpose, which is really around good quality homes for people who need them most. Housing associations built 1 in 4 of all new homes in the country last year, and we built the majority of all new social and affordable homes. We think we are a really important part of the housing mix, not least to addressing those issues of temporary accommodation, but also supporting people who want to get on the housing ladder and ensuring people later in life have somewhere secure and stable to live.
What do you see as the key barriers to addressing the lack of social housing, Kate?
We're going to need a whole range of policy and funding interventions from government that will be crucial to turning things around. So planning reform has a really important role to play. We've really welcomed government's emphasis on a return to housing targets, so ensuring that every council, every area is planning for its future housing need. That's really important. We also welcome the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, and that's a key tool to helping get to the government's 1.5 million homes target. However, planning alone is not going to get us there. Now, to achieve 1.5 million homes over the course of the Parliament means building 300,000 homes a year. And we've only ever got anywhere near those figures when we've had a big social house building programme. We think that we could probably get to 200,000 homes max with the private sector alone. But we also need that additional 100,000 social and affordable housing built. There's huge demand out there, but it's also really important in terms of the viability of sites. When you're building private housing, it's all about kind of market demand, how quickly you can sell. But when you're building social housing, you can let that home as soon as it's completed. So it means that social housing can be countercyclical. It can deliver in a downturn, but it also means it speeds up the pace of delivery on sites because you always know that there's going to be a demand. There's always going to be somebody who wants the keys to that new social rented home.
And we've had talk of building on grain belt or brownfield sites in other countries. There are examples of offices and factory spaces being repurposed for accommodation. Is the government committing to using what we have better? And is that a part of ensuring we get these additional 100,000 social houses built?
It's really important that we look at the most sustainable locations to deliver high quality homes and communities. It's absolutely right that we look at brownfield land, previously developed land, and make best use of that. But even if we built on every brownfield site, if they were all suitable, and they're not all suitable, but if they were all suitable for housing, it wouldn't get us to our 1.5 million homes target. So we do need to bring forward some sites. Some of those will be greenfield sites, and some of them will be within the green belt. Now, it's absolutely right that we look at that in a strategic approach, and we look at those areas of lower quality in the green belt, which the government have coined grey belt. And that might be former petrol stations, industrial sites, of actually making sure that they come forward in the right location with the supporting infrastructure. So that's access to schools and GPs, to public transport, but actually making sure we are meeting our housing need in a sustainable way. In terms of reusing buildings, that can be perfectly sensible too, to convert previously used buildings that were offices into homes. But where we have concerns is what's happened previously with permitted development, where that has happened outside of the planning system. And there's some pretty shocking examples of things like industrial estates that have been converted to housing. And why that's a problem is that they were never planned to have communities in them. So they don't have things like pavements or local schools or bus routes. Also, some of those buildings weren't designed with people living them in mind. So actually being able to make sure that children's bedrooms have windows and fresh air and that they're safe and vibrant places to live. So it's not about being opposed to converting buildings. It's about making sure that that's done within the planning system, not outside. And for us, importantly, making sure that there's an affordable proportion of housing on those sites too.
Your federation has revealed that in 32 local authorities in England, the wait for a family-sized social home is now longer than an entire childhood. And in the 3 most challenged areas, there are waiting lists exceeding 100 years. No one is actually waiting 100 years. So can you tell us how you came to that figure and spell out what the impact is of that kind of wait?
Yeah, as you say, at current social housing letting rates, there are 3 local authority areas in the country that would take over 100 years to clear their current waiting lists for a family size. So that's 3 bedrooms or more homes. And this information was sourced from the local authority housing statistics. So this is data that's published by government, by the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. And we analysed sort of the latest information available and looked at how long it would take to clear those lists based on current rates of letting. And what it reveals is just a really dire situation, an absolutely huge shortage of family-sized accommodation and ever-increasing waiting lists for that type of accommodation. And this has really arisen because of a chronic shortage of social homes.
Can you just explain to our listeners, when we have this huge number of people wanting to move into them, why that sort of demand isn't enough? Why does it need government to contribute the funding to ensure these houses get built?
So, social housing is the most affordable type of accommodation. A social rented home is typically 50% of what you would pay in a private rented home. So, it's much more affordable. It's also secure. So, you have a long term tenancy, you have the stability of a social home. But social housing requires subsidy. And that means that the government invests in grants, and then housing associations borrow money to also invest, and they borrow money against their future income. So it's really important that we know what our rents are going to be, but it's also really important that we have a grant funding arrangement with government that helps support the delivery of social housing. In 2010, the then government cut the Affordable Homes Programme, which is our big capital programme, by 63%. And at that point, they slashed all funding for social rented homes. So they continued to fund other affordable tenures, something called an affordable rent, which is 80% of market rent, and also tenures like shared ownership, which is where you part rent and you part buy. But what we didn't have over that period of time was long-term funding for social housing. That's back on the table now, which is really welcome, but we have a big catch-up to do. We also, during that period, had cuts to our income. So there were rent cuts and there was no funding for regeneration, which is why we're now in this perfect storm where we are seeing more and more need for social housing, but a dire shortage of it being built. And that's why the spending review, which is coming up, is such an important moment for the government to turn this round.
The select committee that I chair, the Environmental Audit Committee, has been concerned that an increase in house building should not come at the expense of our environment and nature. We're particularly worried that existing policies on securing biodiversity shouldn't be watered down, for example, allowing developers to offset environmental damage too easily, rather than avoiding damage where houses are being built. How concerned are you that government will achieve the right balance between providing those much needed homes and protecting our natural environment?
It's really important that we get this right, that in addressing the housing crisis, we shouldn't be exacerbating the climate crisis and vice versa. So we need to work through how we can deliver these much needed new homes in a way that supports and enhances nature. And that's a big challenge for all of us. I think what's different about housing associations is that we don't just build and leave. We invest in the community and we manage those homes into the longer term. So for us, it is really important that what we build stands the test of time, not in 5 or 10 years, but in 50 or 100 years. And that means designing in nature. That means being flood resilient. That means thinking about climate change adaptation. There's already some really great examples there. I think in terms of what the government is trying to do is to try and strike the right balance. And it's our responsibility, both yours as a select committee and ours as a key stakeholder in this, is to make sure what comes forward through legislation and policy gets the right balance so that we're investing in nature enhancement on a site-by-site level, but also at a strategic kind of landscape scale as well, but that we get the balance right in terms of viability so that we can also deliver that desperately needed social and affordable housing.
Now, the government's own independent environmental watchdog, the Climate Change Committee, has said that the UK's housing stock is one of the oldest and worst insulated in all of Europe. Now, retrofitting existing homes has to be a part of any plan to hit net zero targets. Heard from the DESNES Select Committee here in the House of Commons that poorly designed retrofit schemes and the skills crisis, along with costly assurance failures, are pushing the UK's energy targets further off track. What's your experience when it comes to retrofitting, and how well equipped do you think the UK is to tackle the huge need there is to better insulate those homes that already exist?
For us, this is about how do we ensure that we're investing in our existing homes, bringing them up to a decent standard, while also investing in building safety and building tens of thousands of much needed new ones. Across the country, there are about 2.7 million housing association homes. 72% of them currently achieve an energy performance certificate of C or above. So that's much higher than any other tenure. If you look at the private rented sector, for example, that's at around 48% at the moment. So we're making good progress. However, we still have over 715,000 homes that do not yet meet EPCC, and that's our target for 2030. So we really welcomed the government's announcement of 1.29 billion funding through the Warm Homes Social Housing Fund, and that funding is hugely welcome, and that goes up from 2025 to 2028.
On that, Kate, the Warm Homes Plan, which is said to offer different initiatives to improve energy efficiency and to reduce the costs with funds available for social housing operators and local authorities, was widely supported. There are rumours that it might fall victim to government plans to reinstate winter fuel payments for more people. How concerned are you about the need and the importance for government to back the Warm Homes Plan? And do you have concerns about how committed the government are to sticking with it?
There is a huge opportunity here for the government to invest in improving the quality of lower income households' lives through the Warm Homes Plan. Decarbonising social homes is a win-win-win when you take into account the improvements for residents' health and their energy bills, the opportunities to create green jobs in every part of the country, and of course that longer term impact on the environment, which ultimately we're all going to benefit from. So I think what we would say to the government is it's really important that they honour their commitment to the Warm Homes Plan. It was a commitment of 13.2 billion to tackle fuel poverty and the climate emergency across the course of this Parliament, and the spending review is the opportunity for that statement of intent to become a reality.
Now, the quality of social housing has come in for criticism. Some housing campaigners have highlighted slum conditions in the worst cases, and that's been reflected in the rise of complaints to their housing ombudsman. How are social housing providers going to meet the urgent challenge to take effective action against hazards and improve the condition of non-decent homes?
The quality and safety of residents' homes is absolutely housing associations' top priority. Last year, the sector invested 8.8 billion, and over the next 5 years, there are plans to invest 50 billion in repairs and maintenance and the quality of our existing homes. Now, of course, we recognise there are still some homes that don't meet the standards residents expect, and housing associations are committed to making sure that every home is high quality. In terms of meeting the decent home standard, 90% of housing association homes meet that standard. We would love to get to 100%, and we really want to work with government on that. However, we've talked about, we've had crippling cuts to the social housing sector over many years, and they have exacerbated quality issues. And as the Housing Ombudsman recognises this, only an increase in funding over the long term can fully address it. Another factor is overcrowding in social housing. Overcrowding absolutely contributes to damp and mould because of increased condensation, and overcrowding is at the highest levels for 30 years. And again, this can only be solved with funding for new social housing.
I think everyone was deeply affected by the tragic death of 2-year-old Awab Ishak, who died following prolonged exposure to damp and mould. Following that, Awab's law was brought in. Social landlords will be forced to investigate and fix dangerous damp and mould in set time periods. How are social housing providers preparing for the introduction of Awab's law, and what impact do you think that law will have?
Social housing providers are absolutely committed to ensuring that the failures that led to the very tragic death of Awab Ishaq never happen again. And we want all of our homes to be free from serious hazards. This is absolutely the top priority for housing associations. It's making sure our homes are quality and that resident safety is at the heart of everything we do. Housing associations are firmly committed to implementing Awab's law as swiftly as possible and in a way that delivers the best outcomes for residents. And that's why we really support the government in prioritising addressing damp, mould and condensation first. And that is the first focus that comes in October of this year, and that is what we are gearing up to deliver. And that's why we want to work with government, but most importantly with housing association staff, and most importantly with residents, to ensure that we focus on this above all else, that we get this right, that the system change happens before it is rolled out to other hazards.
Now, we've got the spending review coming up. Chancellor Rachel Reeves will be furiously adding things to a spreadsheet and crossing them out again, no doubt, over the course of the weeks, days ahead. You've already referred to some of the things that are on your wish list, but what would be your number one item if you were advising the Chancellor with a view to achieving these housing targets? What does she really need to be prioritising?
For us, the most important thing is having a package of measures to help social landlords rebuild their capacity. So this is about our ability to borrow and our ability to build new homes and invest in existing homes. And to achieve that, we need long-term certainty around housing associations' income. We need access to building safety funding, and we need an ambitious new investment program. So that wasn't one thing, it's three. But if we got that package, we can work together both over the course of this parliament and probably the next, but we could really transform the situation that many people are experiencing in terms of the housing crisis. So that's sort of the short term, the spending review. And then longer term, there's a really big opportunity with having a long-term housing strategy. And again, that's on the cards. We've had the Deputy Prime Minister talk about a long-term housing strategy. I think for us, this is about hope. This is about saying over the course of a decade of renewal, things can change. And this is about having measurable outcomes. So saying, in 10 years' time, no child will be homeless. We can do this. This is also about having a framework to engage with other government departments, because housing, of course, impacts on the economy, on welfare, on the environment, on work, right across the piece.
Well, Kate, I asked you for one priority. You gave me three. I suspect that's why our Chancellor's having sleepless nights right now. But thank you so much for coming on to Committee Corridor, for spelling out the crucial role that you and your members can play in alleviating this housing crisis. Kate, thank you so much for joining us on Committee Corridor.
Thanks very much.
So, what have parliamentary committees been doing to answer these questions? Joe Powell is the Labour Member of Parliament for Kensington and Bayswater. He's a member of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee. In this podcast, we're also going to hear from a House of Lords committee. The Lords committees investigate public policy, proposed laws and government activity. The Lords Built Environment Committee includes a scrutiny of government policies relating to housing and planning. Under the chairmanship of the Conservative peer Lord Moylan, it explored the use of the grey belt. The committee also challenged the previous government about the potential to miss housing targets and environmental ambitions. Thank you both for joining me on Committee Corridor. If I can start with you, Joe, we know that demand for housing far exceeds supply. The Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee recently reported what it described as the sharp end of that demand, temporary accommodation. Can you explain what you found?
Well, we found that the numbers of people in temporary accommodation, so that's things like B&Bs or kind of shorter term private accommodation, often leased by councils, continues to go up significantly. There are now over 160,000 children in temporary accommodation. In London, it's 1 in every classroom. So this problem is not going away, it's getting worse. And unfortunately, it's not just the implications for those families, of which I think all of us will have constituents where we've got horrific stories about the quality of that accommodation and the impact it has on things like education. But it's also starting to have a very real financial pressure on councils too. So we made a number of recommendations about improving the quality of temporary accommodation in things like standards, inspections, data sharing, so that people don't fall between the cracks if they move to a different local authority, for example. But ultimately, the long-term solution to this has to be about increasing the supply of social and genuinely affordable housing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, alongside those costs to councils that you refer to there, just spell out a little bit what you learned about the impact it was having on those families, on those their children's life chances and on life in temporary accommodation.
I know from my own surgeries, as well as being on the committee, the impact it has. I've had families moved out of borough for over a decade, particularly the shortage in my constituency, which is West London, of family-sized social housing is really acute. That means that sometimes people travel for long distances to stay at the same school because they want to maintain that local connection and away from their social networks. It can disrupt their employment chances. They might lose a job because the commute's too far. And then on top of that, we have this real problem of standards. So, we already know, after the horrific death of Aral Bishak in particular, that drew attention to issues around damp and mold, for example, in social housing and the private rented sector. Now, obviously, this government is going to bring in Awab's law, started by the previous government, will be implemented by this government. What we've recommended, and the government seemed minded to accept, is to extend Awab's law into temporary accommodation and private rented accommodation. So initially it was going to be for social housing. If we extend it to those two categories, we think that could have a real difference, because I can't tell you how frustrating it is when someone brings in a doctor's note from their GP saying that this child is being made sick. It has a respiratory illness because of the home that they're living in, and we still can't fix it, and that is simply unacceptable.
Yeah, and as a member of Parliament, I also see exactly those horror stories. Lord Moylan, we know that construction is a major contributor to climate change. Is the government's focus on building new homes the right one, or should we be focusing more on adapting what is there? Your committee looked into building on the grey belt. Can you tell us more about what you found?
Well, I just need to say straight away that because of strict term rotations here, I ceased to be chairman of the committee back in January this year. But you're absolutely right. The reports that you refer to were produced when I was chairing it. We looked at the grey belt. I mean, the committee is a cross-party committee. We're not a NIMBY committee. We certainly agree that there is a need for more housing to be built across the whole spectrum. I mean, affordable housing, private sector housing. There's a shortage in every area you look in, and it needs to be met by new construction. We looked at the grey belt proposals that came from Angela Rayner, and we were intrigued by it, really. A new idea appeared, and that was to make it compulsory for local authorities which didn't have a 5-year supply of land for housing or for commercial purposes to identify adjacent greenbelt land on which they would build it. So that wouldn't necessarily be grey belt land. It would be greenbelt land for those local planning authorities, obviously, that are next to a greenbelt. Many aren't. Of course, once it's built on, it doesn't matter whether it was grey belt to start with or green belt to start with, or what it was like to start with once it's built on. I think the government just needs to be that bit clearer. Essentially, are they looking to find sites in the green belt which are possibly isolated sites, a former factory, a former petrol station or whatever, and looking to develop those? Or are they looking to try and develop what you might call urban extensions to the existing townscape, so that you get to the limit of the town and then you build a bit more. And you can do both, but I think there needs to be some clearer thinking about this, and they can both make a contribution, modest contributions, but important ones, to the need for more housing.
Yeah, now on the Environmental Audit Committee, we had concerns about the final National Planning Policy Framework, although we recognised that it had improved substantially from the initial draft. But our concerns around everything from building on land at flood risk to valuable ecosystem services. How did government respond to the concerns that your committee raised?
Government did respond formally, in the sense that they wrote a formal response. As is often the case, these formal responses are not necessarily as fulsome as you'd like them to be. I don't know about the Commons, but in the Lords we very rarely get responses saying, "What a brilliant ideas, we're going to adopt them all immediately," sadly. We get more defensive responses from government. But I know that they were listening very carefully. In fact, I know they were listening in, so to speak, to our witness sessions, because many of the points that were being made by our witnesses as we took evidence were actually being dealt with in the consultation when it came out, which was roughly at the same time as we finished taking our evidence.
Yeah. Now, Joe, your committee is currently taking evidence on land value capture. Can you explain what it is and how it can make a difference, and why it's important to the government's commitment to building new homes?
Well, I mean, land value capture happens in various forms at the moment. Essentially, at its core, it's about the uplift in land value that might come from planning decisions. So, probably the most prominent example at the moment would be the government's proposal around new towns. Now, when the new towns report comes back and is been tasked with coming up with 12 potential sites for new towns, clearly that is very commercially sensitive information, because as soon as those sites are identified, the land values will go up significantly. And an agricultural land value versus land value that has planning permission obviously is dramatically different. So the idea behind this investigation is to figure out, what are the best models of land value capture that can both get the house building and infrastructure that we need, but also get that contribution to things like the infrastructure that new towns will need. So, we clearly, transport is kind of top of the list in terms of expense, but there's lots of other things that need to be in place in order for new towns to be successful, and for new, smaller housing developments to be successful. So that's what we're looking at the moment, and we are concerned about some of the recent trends in the current model. So Section 106, for example, which is where developers make a contribution. We have a challenge at the moment around viability of actually taking on 106 agreements, and then particularly for the social and affordable housing allocations in big developments. So if they're sitting unused, that's clearly a problem in the system. So we were looking at why that is the case. I think for the big housing associations and the social housing sector, they have certainly felt the financial pressures in recent years from all of the post-Grenfell remediation work they've been required to do. And the cuts in the grant program from government for affordable housing. So, as with so many things, it's all eyes on the spending review to see what might come into the sector that would help them to actually be able to do the house building to meet that 1.5 million target.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. On the Commons Environmental Audit Committee, we've been asking how this government's proposed reforms to national planning policy and house building targets might impact environmental protections and approaches to sustainable development. Lord Moylan, your committee told the last government there was a real risk it would miss both its housing targets and its environmental ambitions. Is it possible for any government to deliver both, do you believe?
Yeah, of course it is. Start from the premise that in a reasonably rich country, you can both build the houses that you need and you can gradually improve the environment. Of course you can. I mean, Anyone who disputes that, I mean, how could that not be the case? But we have set up a system which ensures that the two operate antagonistically to each other, a very legalistic type system in which you have different state agencies working in opposite directions and nobody bringing them together. And that's as true of the last. It hasn't been changed. It's true of this government as it was of the last. And until we actually repair that system, we're not going to make the progress we could. And my own view is, and I think it was the view of the committee as well, that in order to do this, you need to have a plan and you need to have buy-in to the plan. And the plan has to be long-term. Anyone who thinks we're going to fix our problems with sewage in rivers overnight is delusional. It is, insofar as it involves very significant construction. We're talking about a 30 or 40-year plan. And during that plan, there'll be trade-offs. There'll be times when you say, well, we're going to prioritize this over that. And if you can get a coherent plan out there and say, but by the end of it, we'll all have achieved more or less what we want and get public buy-in to it, then I think you would have a lot of cross-party support for something that was deliverable, and governments would be unlikely to change it from one election to another. But at the moment, the whole thing has been highly politicized, but the civil service and the agencies working in government are structurally antagonistic to each other and are getting in each other's way.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, we've heard from Joe the demands there are right now. We know government is politically committed to a target of 1.5 million. Can the development that we need now go hand in hand with that planning, or does it have to follow it? Do you see it being possible for the two to work hand in hand?
I couldn't agree with you more. This is not a recommendation that we let up on our current efforts. It is that while we're pushing ahead with our current efforts, we also stand back and look at the legal structures, the role of the different organizations. Remember, there's a lot, I don't want to be over controversial, but a lot of this is about the interaction of inherited EU law with the rest of our legal system. Much of the environmental legislation affecting house building derives from habitats regulations. And of course, that had and still has a superior legal status to planning law, which is something the EU never took an interest in. There's never been an EU interest in planning law. And so when it comes to this tangle between the two, the environmental law tends to win, and you get a sort of stasis, as you do over the Dutch in judgment and other similar sorts of decisions. Of course, they can be reconciled, but not under the existing structure. So it needs to be looked at from that legal point of view and changed. But it is not by any means saying that we should give up at all on what the government is driving forward with at the moment.
Yes. Now, Joe, I mean, from your perspective, given the evidence that you heard about the impact on families living in temporary accommodation and everyone's desire to see them into more stable accommodation, and what we were just hearing there from Lord Moylan, I mean, where do you see this balance landing between the importance of building quickly and the importance of building better and making sure we get it right? How much potential is there for that to go badly wrong? And how does governments balance out those competing demands of the immediate and the need to have a strategic approach?
I think it's a very good question. And I'm the Member of Parliament where Grenfell Tower sits. So I have a particular kind of interest in this, because I think the last thing that the Grenfell bereaved and survivors and community would have wanted is that we slow down the supply of new social, affordable market, all tenure type housing that we need. So one of the, we just released last week a letter to the Minister now responsible for Grenfell, Alex Norris, looking, for example, at the building safety regulator. So one of the things that a lot of new developments say they're getting stuck with is getting through the building safety regulator in a swift enough period of time to get sign off and get on with building. Now, of course, we absolutely need to have learn the lessons from Grenfell in terms of product regulation. Government's got a green paper looking at that. We obviously have a developer levy to pay into paying for some of the remediation. But in terms of new build, we obviously want the standards to be high enough so that we don't risk a horrific tragedy like that happening again. But I think the building safety regulator in particular clearly has an issue with its own capacity to get projects through its sign-off swiftly enough. I don't accept that it has to be a kind of hard trade-off, but if you're going to put in place a new system, it needs to be more agile and speeding up, because otherwise, all you're going to do is end up with what I fear is more vocal campaigns about lessening those post-Grenfell lessons, when I think actually it's about implementing them in a better way. Just to add that to the kind of conversation, I think obviously interest rates coming down is probably one of the main things that will help viability for a lot of these projects to get going. So the more that the bank can cut interest rates, probably the better for that house building target in terms of other things that will play into this. And just briefly on the kind of nature discussion, we've heard a lot of evidence in the committee about how the current system is kind of failing on its own terms. So we have this big nature depletion issue, and at the same time, this very lengthy process and judicial review risk and all the rest of it. So if our goal is to both do house building and to improve nature, I do think this new system of kind of paying into a pot, which can provide better nature outcomes, even if it's not on the same site, seems to me like that has the potential to sort of, again, remove some of the confrontation around this issue that has ended up with a kind of lose-lose situation for both housing and nature, and potentially offers a better solution. But again, the implementation will be key.
Absolutely. Well, Joe Powell, Lord Moylan, thank you so much for your contributions today. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing more about the work your committees do. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby.
Thank you.
So, my thanks to all our guests for sharing their insights, and to you for tuning in. Next time on Committee Corridor, we'll be considering the significant challenges facing our water sector today, from pollution to security of supply. You can find all our previous episodes of this podcast by searching UK Parliament and Committee Corridor. Please like and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. I'm Toby Perkins, and this has been Committee Corridor. Thank you for listening.